What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture. It's a place of history. It's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution
for the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Good evening, good evening. Good to be with you on this inauguration eve. As the country prepares for the inauguration of our 46th president, Joseph Biden, but we are also counting down to the swearing in of the first woman, the first Black woman, the first Indian woman as the Vice President of the United States. I have a special place in my heart for Kamala Harris, who is my fellow Howard University graduate. So to all my Bisons out there, a hearty, very hearty HU, you know. Let me also take this moment to recognize the difficult time we find ourselves in as the country mourns over 400,000 Americans passing from COVID-19. We, the people, can help keep each other safe, and I hope that we consider each other as we venture out during our days or re-enter our homes. My name is Novella Ford, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions for the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. As you saw in the video, the Schomburg Center is one of the world's leading cultural institutions dedicated to the collection, preservation, and interpretation of global Black experiences. While our doors remain closed due to COVID-19, we continue to provide ways to access our digital collections and deliver online public programs. Visit our website at schomburg.org for more information, and check out some of our past programs on our channel at livestream.com/Schomburg Center. The African Lookbook, A Visual History of 100 Years of African Women, draws on curator and author Catherine E. McKinley's extensive collection of historical and contemporary photos to present a visual history spanning 100 years from 1870 to 1970 of what is among the earliest photography on the continent. I love in the introduction how Edwidge Dundecat refers to this lookbook as really a communal family album. Joining Catherine in conversation is Amy Sall, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of SUNU, the Journal of African Affairs, Critical Thought, and Aesthetics. You can also follow that online at SUNU Journal. The two will take a deeper look at the images that upend the colonial interpretation of the lives of African women to tell a different story of power, self-expression, and self-determination. Following the presentation and conversation, there will be an audience Q&A, so please use the chat box, which says, not the chat box, but the box that says Q&A to submit your questions at any time during the program, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. Also, don't forget, you can order your copy of the African Lookbook from our Schomburg shop online at schomburgshop.com. All proceeds benefit the Schomburg Center and programs like this evening. Catherine E. McKinley is a curator and a writer whose books include the critically acclaimed Indigo, A Journey Along the Ancient Indigo Trade Routes in West Africa, and the Book of Sarahs, a memoir about growing up Black and Jewish in the 1960s and the 80s. She's taught creative nonfiction writing at Sarah Lawrence College and Columbia University. The McKinley Collection, which is featured here inside of this lookbook, is a personal archive representing African photographies from 1870 to the present. Amy Sall has a keen interest in cultural studies, African affairs, and artistic expression. She's interested in the ways in which visual culture, literature, post-colonial, and critical theory inform, shape, and encourage contemporary discourses surrounding the socioeconomic, political, and the cultural. Amy Sall is also a collector of vintage vernacular photography and printed matter ephemera coming from Africa and the diaspora, circa 1950s to the 1970s. I think it's such a treat to have these two women in conversation about collections, about the African gaze, and about the agency that so many of these women represent and present inside of these photographs. We are recording the program for the archive, but you are not, the audience are not part of the recording. Please be mindful of your fellow audience members in the chat, and thank you again for tuning in. So first, we're going to see a few images from the book. Again, I remind you, please order the book. It is beautiful. I have a pre-copy that will not do it justice. And then following that, you will have the conversation with Catherine McKinley and Amy Sall. Please enjoy.
Hi, everyone. It's a bit strange not being able to see everyone's faces, but I trust and hope that you guys are all well. Hi, Catherine. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with Catherine McKinley. I have to say it's a really beautiful full circle moment because I came across Catherine's work when I was a college senior doing research on African textiles and how it was circulated throughout the West. And Indigo was a book that I definitely searched into and leaned into. So it's really nice to be able to finally connect with Catherine after all these years of just having known her work and sort of like following her online and meeting her virtually, but for the first time, technically in person, and being able to share and hold space and talk about this amazing collection.
Thank you,
Amy. And also happy publication day. Congratulations. This is a really big moment. This is a huge day. I have my copy here and I'm going to second Novella's remarks and encourage everyone to definitely order a copy because it's such a treasure trove. It's almost like having this beautiful photo album in your possession. And I love that the book, the language is so accessible too. So it's not riddled with any sort of academic jargon. It's not something that, you know, you can't get into. It's accessible language. The images are beautiful. There's some anecdotes. It's really a nice balance of historical context and anecdotes and visuals. So I definitely encourage everyone to get a copy and dig into the beautiful work that Catherine has offered us. So this conversation, obviously we're all watching from our homes. So I want the conversation to be informal and relaxed. But also engaging and informative and all that stuff. I trust everyone will walk away with a few gems. But to sort of structure it, I think it would be best to sort of have a larger conversation, Catherine, about sort of the politics of collecting, what collecting these sorts of images, these documents as a Black person means. I will say that part of what encouraged me to start collecting was that I found that very few collectors looked like us, right? There were very few Black and African collectors collecting African portraits or African vernacular photographs. And I think that one of the biggest frustrations for me was just every time I tried to trace back the provenance of an image, it was always some white Europeans like private collection. And I think there's a lot of discussion about the necessity and the importance for us to document ourselves and to, you know, take our own photos and tell our own stories. But that's sort of like one part of the process. That's not sort of maintaining full agency. What good are those images if they're always going to, you know, be sitting in some white European's private collection? So I sort of want that to break open the discussion, and then we'll go into some of the images. And maybe you can sort of walk us through how you started to collect and what your pull towards collecting was. Like, did you have a mission statement? Did you have an angle that you were trying to sort of focus your collection on? How did you come to collecting what came to be the amazing McKinley collection?
That's a good question. I'm glad that you kind of set this within a political context of collections and some of the recent politics about the repatriation of things and who things should belong to, and should I, as a non-continental African, own or have any kind of provenance over these things, or should you even, you know, who does it belong to if it's not on the continent perfectly kept within domains there? It's a big question. I think about, there's nothing that I've done with the collection where those things are not nagging. And at the same time, I also feel like the work, the photos, the images that are here are really, they tell a story of this, you know, huge cosmopolitanism, and that is expansive. And I think that's where I start to fit myself into the picture, and other collectors like you. You know, we live and we move back and forth between these different spaces. We're in real relationships with people here and abroad. And it's a kind of dialectic that's ongoing, and that is, you know, it's charged with a lot of things. And there is a real sense of responsibility. So I do feel like, as Edwige said in the introduction, that it's a communal family album. I feel like the photos do belong to all of us. It's an inheritance. These are our ancestors. These are people that a lot of us hope to know better. And we have a lot of work to do to break down assumptions and relationships and, you know, to really examine again, what does Pan-Africanism mean? What do all these things mean that haven't been spoken of very much for a long time? So that's kind of what's in my head as I'm doing it. I started collecting in the early 90s. I took a first trip to Senegal, Ghana, and Ivory Coast, and people would give you photos, you know, you'd make friends, fast friends, and then as you were leaving, they give you a photo, and everybody was always impeccably dressed because photos were expensive and people treated it like a real occasion. You didn't just go get a snapshot. You, even at color studios, it was something that you invested in. So people just give you these lovely photos, and I kept them. And then as I got more interested in the indigo history and in fashion history, I was trying to find the evidence of the earliest textiles and fashions. And I had to rely on the colonial sketchbooks or on sculpture. Sculpture doesn't tell you very much about textiles. Even if they're evident, you can't tell what, you know, what color or whatever. So I was looking at the colonial sketchbooks, and they were frustrating because the colors were never accurate and the faces were really odd and oddly Europeanized. And so I started to say, okay, where is the earliest photography? And the earliest photography is in the like the 1850s, 1856. That's when it really began to reach the continent and the colonial trade. And those photos just opened a whole world, you know, almost an unimaginable world for me who grew up on National Geographic, Essence, Ebony, etc., where you had this competing, like the war pornography and then the kings and queens of Africa, you know, we're like next to God.
Right.
Those two competing photos.
Right.
Yeah.
There's something that you said that was extremely important, this idea of having a sense of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think about how important it is to have an ethics of care when dealing with the archive. I think a lot about, it's now that I think about it, when I'm engaging with the archive or when I'm learning about the archive or as I'm trying to construct my own archive, I think I get a lot of guidance from Black women.
Mm-hmm.
I think Thea Hartman, I'm thinking of Tina Camp, you as well. And what you guys all have in common is this idea of extending an ethics of care to the archive, right? Because I think, again, going back to my frustration about why it was so annoying to me that I always traced back these images and they were always in white European collections, was because I never got a sense of care. I always got a sense of some sort of capitalistic art market sort of politic that was always attached to that. Whereas I feel like the McKinley collection, like you're really a custodian of these images. Like you care a lot about the women and the sitter, you know, other sitters who are in these images, and there is a sense that you are caring for them, that there is a responsibility, and that's what comes through in the McKinley collection. I just get frustrated when you take some of these images that really, as you were describing, people would get dressed up, you know, there were snapshots. These were really mementos. These were meant to be souvenirs. These were meant to be memories. But then somehow, some way, they've sort of been churned into like this commodity, which, you know, it's a double-edged sword because, you know, on one hand, certain photographers benefit from it, but at the same time, these images become commodified. And so they are stripped from this context of being these mementos, these souvenirs, these things to circulate privately. And so I think what is important with what you're doing with your collection is that you're sort of taking you're taking that back. You're saying it's not just supposed to be about this art world context, right? We're taking that back. We're extending this ethics of care. We're bringing it back to the origins of the intentions of these images.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really also about looking at them very differently. So there's studio photography that can be very high, fine art photography that we talk about in the art historical context. And then there's vernacular photography. It's just snapshots and something fun. And I think it's important to look at them together and not kind of separate them. The separation is driven by commerce in particular. Yeah, and there's also, you know, I feel like particularly because of the history and the weight of some of the images that I can't just bring them in and not be involved in their caretaking. So I've learned a lot about preservation and that sort of thing. And it's fascinating. And it's something that I hope in some way we can extend to people who are collecting and working as archivists, you know, abroad.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot to learn from you because my collection is still small and growing, but I am entering this space of like, okay, how do I fully immerse myself in the entire process? Because I don't want to neglect any part of the caretaking. And so preservation, like literally not even touching them without having the gloves on and making sure that like things are neatly placed where they need to be, because that is part of making sure that these histories are well preserved and that you're not just treating them as, you know, things that don't deserve the respect and reverence.
Yeah. And really it's a question of who's it for. You know, it's mine, but it's for something else. I hope that the intention is that in the book you'll see some collage work by Frida Orapabo. The intention is to engage with particularly African women artists and also to make it accessible to use it in public programming and to make it so that it is our family album, whether I'm, you know, whether it's in my house or eventually in an institution.
Right. That brings me to another point, this idea of collaboration with African women, which comes through strongly in the book. Not only is it a book about African women in images, but you've collaborated with Frida, who's an amazing artist. You, Jacqueline Woodson, Edwidge Denticat have made contributions to the book. Why was it important for you to sort of create this communal space for African women?
You know, it's interesting. At first, it was just me, it was me in the book, and you know that's what it was. And then you start to think, okay, it needs an intro and it needs these other things. And I did think a lot about who that would be, and it seemed to make sense to bring a kind of diaspora position into the book as well.
Yeah, it's definitely like a diasporic collaboration, but also trans-temporal, because I do see the women in the actual images as also collaborators, right? Like you guys are all engaging in this large conversation of beauty, of history, of the gaze. And so it really is like a trans-temporal, diasporic, trans-spatial, beautiful collaboration. And that really comes through in the book. And that was one thing that I kept thinking about as I was reading all the passages and looking through the images, and like, this is really for women, by women, for women, for, you know, everyone, I guess, but like by Black women, which is extremely important considering, as I've mentioned before, a lot of these images, like they're not mediated, they're not governed, they're not collected by us. Usually it's usually, you know, specifically white men who collect these images from what I can tell. So it's really nice to have this sort of body of work be completely about the African woman.
Yeah. And it extends to the program, even the fact to, you know, to have a conversation like this with you.
I mean, as I said, like this is such a full circle moment for me. So to be included in this collaboration, like even in its extended form, it means a lot, especially because we do have a lot of, you know, interests that coincide. And it's, for me, it was just such a breath of fresh air to come across the McKinley collection, because it was really such an exercise to try to look for Black collectors who are specifically collecting African photographs or these sorts of documents. And the McKinley collection was really just like something I'd never come across before, like really expansive, but also, again, it has that element of care. Like it's not just about the art world politics, or not just about how can I sell this image for this much. It was really about, this is for the people. I'm trying to collect and amass these images just to sort of make it accessible and available for everyone, because these are our stories and our histories. And so it's important that people like us sort of be the ones to preserve and collect and help with how things are disseminated, because as we know, dissemination, how things are spread and circulated, that's very much how part of the problem a lot of the times with a lot of these images, which sort of brings me back to another question that I have, and maybe these are sort of disparate points, but bear with me. You talk about the sewing machine as a colonial tool or a tool of empire. And that was something I had not considered before coming across this book. We know that the camera is a tool of empire because of how it was able to sort of give rise to the colonial project, sustain it, not just the actual camera as a machine, but how images are circulated and disseminated that's what, substantiated and gave weight to the colonial project. But this idea of the sewing machine, can you sort of walk all of us through or talk about how you arrived at that claim and why did you sort of come to this conclusion? Because it was really like a light bulb moment for me. I didn't consider it, but how you described it and just sort of thinking back, like, yeah, actually it all makes sense. But before I started giving my interpretation, I would love for you to share with us how you came across that.
Yeah, it's funny because it actually came to me at a table with a bunch of white male, very wealthy collectors who own African collections, very important ones. And we were having sushi and I don't know, we were having a conversation about something in industry in Africa. And I just, like, the two things came together, the camera and the sewing machine. And so I just blurted something out about it at the table that sounded ridiculous. And then I was on the spot to really, bear down on my claim. And I said, okay, this is not, it's not unfounded because the sewing machine came to West Africa in the late 1800s and the camera in 1865. So they coincided around the same time. And they were two instruments. The sewing machine was used primarily for the sewing of uniforms. Again, it was all about the colonial project. So it was just sew uniforms. They were in the holding stations in the colonial forts along the coast. And they were being used to sew uniforms and to piece together cloth that was going to be traded in essence for exchange of human lives. One slave for 2 yards of cloth or something that approximates that. So here are these things that they're being held by colonial powers. They're in the service of empire, but very quickly became democratized. So by 1865, cameras were available in Senegal, all along the Atlantic coast of West Africa. And they very, very quickly, African men took up the camera and set up studios immediately, by mid 1860s. And they were very much in competition with European male photographers. And that's an important thing because most people just talk about the gaze and the lens and power in very specific terms. And they say, okay, we're not interested in colonial photography, but it's all colonial photography under colonialism. And we have to know that not only were a lot of those photographers African, they were African-American, they were Brazilian returnees who left plantations and returned to home. So, and the sewing machine democratized much, much more quickly. First, it was only for Europeans and for African royalty and elites. And then within 10, 15 years, it became more and more quotidian. And so my idea is that, okay, there's the car, like there are all these different, there's electricity, there are all the potential tools and things that electricity powers, but those instruments did not reach into most women's lives and did not reach into most African lives. They were, temperamental. Not everybody had access to them. Even now it's hard to always have power and running water, etc. So I was thinking about the sewing machine and the cameras, the two things where women were really able to turn they were instruments used against them, but they were able to flip them to their own advantage. So somebody, very soon a sewing machine became a dowry item. So if a woman was married, if they were of any reasonable wealth, they would have a sewing machine and the woman could then make money sewing, lease out her sewing machine or do any number of things with it. It was a real tool.
Oh my God.
And the camera was that was the place where, okay, there is absolutely the narrative of, typologies and categorizing, and it was used against many, many, many people. And there also is a long history of people going and hiring photographers to have this occasion of photographing the self. So.
Thank you so much for sort of laying that out, because at first, when you first hear it, it's like an interesting, almost a jarring claim, but it makes complete sense when you think about it, and the way that you've explained it, like everything clicks. And just the idea that both of these tools that these machines that came out of this very specific colonial sort of framework, but then were tools that were subverted to empower, right? Like I always think about the camera as being this transformative or this sort of like chameleon type of machine where it was once a very violent thing, right? And even the act of shooting a camera, you know, Susan Sontag speaks a lot about that, the violence that's enacted through the camera. And of course, when you think about colonialism, like we don't even have to get into the levels of violence that were there, and just how the camera was able to help further that violence and to justify that violence. But to have that, you have the camera go from that context to being something that empowers, to being something that becomes part of one's livelihood, to being something that becomes part of memory making, and just capturing joy and exuberance and optimism, and especially as we are talking about the post-independence, you know, era. So it's interesting that the sewing machine has that same ability to go from this very sort of oppressive colonial thing to being something that becomes quite empowering, or helps women sort of reclaim their economic, you know, like freedom and this idea of sovereignty. And I'd never, again, to reiterate, I'd never considered the sewing machine, but it makes complete sense. So maybe we should sort of talk about some specific images just to sort of do a reading. And I always, if my students are out there watching, hello, I always say, like, you need to read an image as if it's text, right? Because there's so much beyond what you're seeing. There is obviously what you're seeing up front, but there's so much subtext. And I want to do a bit of closely reading some of these images. But before we do that, I'd love to ask you, I know that you've been collecting for such a long time. Do you come across different things every time you come across one of the images? Like, is there something new that jumps out, or do you reframe things in a different way? Like, how is that experience revisiting these images?
It's always reframing. Even you and I had a conversation earlier, and we both zeroed in on a detail.
Yeah.
And I just started to think about many things very differently. But it's you know, collecting is obsessive. You're kind of always poking around for things. And, you know, you could go and you intend not to swoop it all up, you know, but then I'll see, like, I just found a postcard that it wasn't really all that remarkable. It's a landscape. It was like, but it was a Congolese card, and it's from about 1900, and the photographer is Senegalese. So it's a Senegalese photographer who a lot of the photographers were itinerant, and they worked the coast in particular, which is why a lot of the images in the book are focused on kind of the Atlantic coast and the Sahel. But, you know, so I couldn't pass by something like that. Or you find one woman in 6 or 7 different iterations, and then, you know, there's a story in that, or there's information or material that's important. And I think not just about myself, but okay, if somebody else is coming in and looking at this question, how is this useful? How does this kind of knit together the total arc of the history?
Right.
So yeah.
Why don't we get into the first image then, and we can sort of give, we don't have to dissect it completely, but we can sort of give like a reading of this image. I mean, this was one of the images that struck me, mainly because it's definitely not a natural pose, clearly. And so it makes me wonder what was the conversation that took place between the photographer and the sitter. Of course, we will never know, but it does make one wonder, like, what was the discussion there? Because this is very much an unnatural pose. So maybe you want to offer some of your observations, or why you were led to this particular image.
There's something, I love the face on this young woman. So that was one. I often select by faces. It feels very intimate. It feels like it's a conversation. Even the selection is a conversation with the sitter. And there's something about, I think this girl actually reminds me quite a bit of someone. But so here's a shot in a colonial garden. It's obviously somebody's yard. It's probably, it looks like a domestic space, like someone's personal garden. And it's just it's a curious and kind of sad photo. The chairs that people, I mean, somebody could do an entire study on chairs, because people were bringing over just the most extensive range of chairs from Europe and everywhere. But so this girl, you know, it's hard to read, but her pose looks unnatural. And you and I were reading this image a week or so ago, and we talked about the foot and how like the foot looks so abject in a way and uncomfortable. And it kind of, it betrays what might be, her face is hard to read, right? We're not sure about her comfort or discomfort. It's certainly not the classic, you know, story of exploitation. And yet you sense that there's exploitation there. You know, why is this girl in this space? Is she part of the domestic, you know, is she a domestic in the household, or is she a concubine? What would her story have been? But I think the foot really betrays everything.
Yeah, I think the reason why this image sort of jumped out at me is that sense of discomfort that really comes through. There's nothing natural about that foot being angled that way. To me, and I think this came through in our earlier conversation, our private conversation, to me, it's almost as if that foot is trying to stabilize her because she is so uncomfortable. That's what I'm inferring. That's the sense that I'm getting. And it makes me wonder, like, the image maker. I don't know if this person, the name is in the lower left-hand corner.
Yeah, we don't know who JN is.
Right.
We don't know if it's a studio or the photographer.
But it just makes me think about just the level of discomfort that the sitter had to go through in order for this image to be produced.
It's unsettling. It feels like there's a grave behind where she sits. That hole always bothered me.
Oh, see, that's something that didn't even come through when I was looking at that before. Like, I'd not paid attention. I was so focused on this girl's foot, just because to me, it just says so much, even more so than the face, because to me, it connotes this idea of discomfort and let me hold this uncomfortable position because I'm being told to. I don't know, there's an unbalanced, obviously, nature, like in terms of like power dynamics, and clearly because I don't know, she might be, I don't know if she's someone that was in the house as a domestic, or I don't know what the situation, we don't know, but there's a lot to be said about the power dynamics here and how I think she, you know, it's just unbalanced, and there's a definite level of discomfort that's coming through that makes me almost uncomfortable. But when you first come across it, it is a striking image. It is a striking image.
Well, with a lot of the early colonial, the European photography, there's always this kind of juxtaposition of beauty and terror, or you know, even the foot is so, it almost looks mangled in some way. It could just be dirt, you know, but the foot is definitely doing all the feeling.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension. And I think it makes me, you know, earlier in our the beginning of our conversation, I asked like what drew you to collect, like was there a mission statement, was there an ethos? And for me, one thing that I'm trying to be conscious of, and when I'm collecting, is like I tend to stay away from colonial photographs, just because I'm more interested, you know, of course, as you mentioned, there were African photographers photographing during the colonial times, but I think it's because when I come across images like this, I don't want to be reminded of that discomfort. I just want to get to the parts where there was more freedom, more sovereignty, more sort of agency. But it's all, like, these images are extremely important because it's all part of African visual history. You cannot talk about the post-independence images without confronting colonial images, without understanding what the post-independence, post-colonial images were born out of. It's extremely important to have that sense of genealogy and to be able to and also trace the evolutions of image making in the African context. But I realize that I do tend to stay, I think I do have a few colonial images, but I try to stay away from them. But although like now I'm like determined to find images by African photographers during this time? Because I think that's
a lot of them are postcards because
yeah.
They were bought and circulated,
yeah,
and circulated pretty quickly. So in order to trace the African photographers, you often have to go through the postcards because it just, they were in multiples. You can find them easily, or more. Most of them, a lot of them are quite rare, but you can get access to them.
I'm definitely intrigued. So maybe we can move to an image that's sort of farther away in time from this image. Yes. So in the book, you have a few of Auntie Karoma's photos, and she gives me everything that I need. I love her. I want to meet her. How did you come across these images? Like, what's the story behind her?
These Auntie Karoma is a close friend of mine now. I think almost 25 years.
Oh, amazing.
And she actually helped me a lot with my indigo research. And these are from her personal album. So this is the kind of thing where she had multiples. She had like 5 or 6 copies of the same photograph. And so I had no problem taking the ones that I wanted. Yeah, but this is an image of her. She would have been a teenager, and it was taken she's Ghanaian, and this was a studio in Accra, in Labadi. And it was taken the year before Ghana's independence, so 1956. And this is, it's a really interesting picture. I mean, the hair really harkens to Nkrumah, and Lumumba and a lot of other, I haven't really looked into, but I'm very interested in the evolution of parted hairstyles. But they certainly reflect on leadership around that time. And, she's inching towards the mini skirt, not quite there yet, but it's a kind of interesting dialectic with the moment, because as Ghana was nearing independence, there was so much attention put toward modesty and nation building and, a kind of exemplary Ghanaian womanhood. And you're also seeing the traces of a love for a kind of colonial fashion as well. So it's a great photo. And in the book, there's a section of photos of Karama. So in just less than a decade, you'll see her in afros. And, there's kind of wonderful stories that go with the afro as well. Because this is also a time in places like Mali, particularly in the Sahel, the mini skirts and afros were part of that so-called revolution. But, elder people, the people who were in the Seydou Keita photographs, did not like it at all. Right. And there were kind of re-education camps where they were dragging young people in these fashions off the street and, really brutalizing them and trying to turn them back towards modesty and towards a level kind of very indigenous, progressive dress that wasn't this at all.
There's so much I want to read into this image, but I think we're actually running out of time and we have to allocate. See, I knew we were going to fly through this hour. There's just so much, even just on the images alone, there's so much to be said. So as these images are sort of playing now on loop, we'll give the audience more time to sort of get into just a sneak peek of what you have to offer from the McKinley collection. I'm going to go through and select some of the images that were in the Q&A section. Just a reminder, if you guys have questions, please do use the Q&A function as opposed to dropping them in the chat. That will be much easier. Bear with me 1 second. How might we envision capturing images in the present and link them to the past? I'm also wondering if the current images would be too adulterated by Western gaze, like our current looks past the point of no return.
Well, I don't know if they're too current. These are similarly very current. One thing that my earliest education around African fashion and photography was really that as much as we talk about tradition and somebody wearing a tradition, like these women are wearing boo-boos. So, that's quote unquote tradition. But it actually, the story of the boo-boo really coincides with the Islamic campaigns in West and Northern Africa. So it's not that current. Like each thing has a story. So these are boo-boos, but the material is the latest fashion from Europe, being rigorously traded into West Africa. So the conversations with contemporary photos are actually really interesting. I think I would encourage you to push for putting those things side by side.
Right. Amazing. So the next question, what was the most, I suppose meaningful is what the commenter meant to say. What is the most meaningful photo to you?
The most meaningful.
If you can choose.
That's hard. That's hard to say. Well, okay. I don't know if you can see the one behind me. It's a really popular Bay photo. Everybody probably knows it. I think it's that one may be the most meaningful in a sense, because I was thinking just recently that is our Mona Lisa in a way, or that is, I mean, to get into the vulgarities of the market, that just sold, a different version of this just sold at Sotheby's for $42,000. So in the space of less than 20 years, it's just accelerated from like $2,000 or $3,000 to $40,000. But I mean, that's a kind of vulgarity. But I think that the image is really, it's just a kind of defining image in the body of African photographies.
Yeah, it's
I'm very attached to it.
This comes around, everyone posts that one on their Instagram.
But I think it needs to be talked about and looked at with, in an art historical way with much more seriousness.
Absolutely. Of course, there's so much I want to say, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to move on to the questions. The discussion surrounding this photo reminds me of commentary Sadia Hartman. Sadia lays out for us in Wayward Lives. Okay, great. Yeah, that's a lovely comment. Off topic, but Amy, are you from Senegal? Okay, yes. Born and raised in New York, though. My entire family is from Senegal. What are the re-education camps called again?
I don't know if they had names. They may have. Do you know, Amy, at all?
No, actually. I mean, this is actually new information for me. So
yeah, in Mali had very kind of aggressive camps, but I think they were kind of military-based camps, and elder people. Like if you look at the Sidibe and the Keita photos in particular, people talked about that generation in the Keita photos as the pretenders.
In the 50s as the,
yeah. I mean, again, it's that whole question of what's tradition. So they're wearing these dresses that everybody celebrates, and they have all these kind of European props. And their children who grew afros and put on mini skirts said, you were the pretenders.
Yeah.
You were mimicking this life that's not yours. And now we are here to show you what our life is. And ironically, they're mimicking spaghetti westerns and gymnastics and that sort of thing. But they were also being rounded up by their fathers and uncles, et cetera, and by the military and various government groups. And they were put in camps to be re-indigenized.
Interesting. I'm going to deeply.
And I don't know how widespread it was, but it was significant.
Okay. Can you ladies speak about Western photographers' obsession with shooting African women bare-chested? National Geographic recently apologized for this practice. Good question.
The Colonial Archive is full of bare-breasted women. And that's part of why people have asked why I'm collecting women's images primarily. And the archive is not solely women, but women are disproportionately part of the colonial record. And I wanted to correct the record and preserve it. And I felt very protective towards like all these bare-breasted women. Some of those images were literally circulated as pornography. So somebody a colonial agent in Guinea would send it to his friend in Indonesia and somebody else in Paris and that sort of thing. And those images had an amazing reach. They just, they went everywhere.
That's why I say the circulation of the images, how they were disseminated and circulated, like really was part of how the colonial project became so successful. It was beyond just taking the image, it was how they were circulated. And a lot of these sorts of like typical, and I'm going to use air quotes, of course, because it's like what is typical sort of African, what Western or the European sort of administrators and these sorts of figures considered the authentic African usually were the bare-breasted women or the woman pounding millet by the hut. Like these were constituted as the authentic African. But also these images circulated in a way to justify the need to civilize these Africans, right? Because look at these Africans bare-chested looking like this. Like that was a way for the colonial project to be so successful, because it sort of signified this idea like, okay, there needs to be a level of like civilizing and educating these people, because look at how they are, look at how they live. So the photos were very successful in convincing or like planting something in the psyche of the West, that like Africans were, you know, these, you know, I don't know, savages or whatever the terms, we all know the terms that, you know, Africans have been described as. But yeah, these images, the circulation, there was a lot of violence in how successful the circulation of these images was.
And I looked, I cannot find a single African photographer that has a bare-breasted sitter. I haven't seen one.
Yeah, that says a lot.
Surprise.
That's a lot. There's one question that's in the chat. What was the first photo you acquired, and when did you begin to think it was an archive? And they also say fantastic presentation. Wow.
Thank you. The first one was, I stayed when I got to Ghana, I stayed in the University of Legon, like the chalets. And there was a cook there, a young guy, Kwame, and I have a picture of him, and he's like in Sunday dress, but he has a chicken. He's about to, you know, like we're gonna have Sunday dinner. He's dressed and he has a chicken with the wings spread out. And it's a fantastic picture, and he gave it to me as I was leaving. And it just, you know, when people would give you the gift of a photo, it felt like those, I don't know if anybody remembers those Victorian calling cards. I mean, it's a funny thing, but I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and you got those cards, you could put your name on them, and then you would give them out to your friends. And it was very precious.
Yeah.
So it had that same feeling.
Yeah, and I think also the intentions of a lot of these photographers, Sidibe, Philippe Kujina, like all of that, I feel like, well, not that I feel, I know that was part of their intentions, because they were, like we discussed earlier, they were mementos, they were souvenirs. And that's why I always have this tension when it comes to, like, for example, the Sidibe selling for 42,000, which, you know, that's a whole other conversation. We can talk about that all day long, but just the idea that these images began as something to circulate privately and just to capture moments, going from that to sort of this exploitative, commodified, capitalistic situation that surrounds these images. I don't know, there's a lot of, I don't know, for me, it's really hard to reconcile the tension there, but also I love going to see these images. So it's like, I don't know, there's a lot to sort of unpack and reconcile, but I do love that these images, like the one, like how you began collecting, came from this moment when you're about to have Sunday dinner, and like, you know, you left with this beautiful, precious gift. Yeah, which I think, again, which is why it's so important. It's important that the McKinley collection is the way that it is, because it has maintained that level of just care and integrity. Let's see, we have a few more minutes. Does your work also extend to South Africa, where there is a long history of activism among Black South African garment workers like Lillian Ngoyi, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing that, who in fact has a sewing machine as her memorial to her work in the area of women's liberation? Are there parallels between West Africa, South Africa, and women in the US too?
There are parallels if you want to put it on the grand scale. And then I think a lot of the parallels should just be demolished, because I mean, South Africa, particularly with apartheid and the restrictions on image making and television, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, apartheid used photography in the reverse. They really like shut down, forbade photography, did not allow people any image making at all for a long time. And so that's one particular history. The West African history, where there's so much African participation, is something, you know, that's very different. I think it's really important to look at those things and, you know, kind of within their own context and not universalize them. I've done some work in Namibia with a photographer, Tabiso Sakala, who died a couple years ago. but we did photographs of Herero women on the streets in Namibia. It was really a lot of fun. It was fantastic. And again, it's so like the politics of representation changed so much from one place to another. And even the studios, you know, if you look in Ghana, if you go from studios from north to south, there are vast differences, you know, Muslim versus non-Muslim studios. They're just very, very different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I can talk all day about just
yeah,
like the actual the studio environment itself, but we'll save that for another time. Okay, so someone asked if we can run the images while we're speaking. I think that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
How can we do one more question? Okay.
Yes.
So, okay, cool. A question that I recognize the person who submitted this. Hello. Having different countries in your collection, do you think there was a cross influence or each country had its own personal style in photographs?
Well, yeah, different. I mean, just take Senegal, for instance, like around the turn of the century, 1900 to 1920. There, I don't know how many studios there were. There were tons. They were African-American, they were Lebanese, they were so many different things. And like with the African photographers, their studio apparatus, like one would be very ornate and one would be very different. And so they're just, it's really hard to universalize. It's so much fun to look at the different things.
Seriously, everyone should definitely order and purchase this book because it is such a treasure trove. I mean, it's really like having your own communal photo album. And there's such a great sort of regional representation and really great historical context, really great anecdotes. Yeah, so if you are intrigued by the sneak preview, the little bit that you've seen sort of circulating tonight, then you should definitely purchase this book. I think we're out of time, unfortunately. This could have gone on for hours, truly, but it was such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Catherine. Thank you so much for this really generous, kind offering. I mean, the African Lookbook is such important work, and I can't wait to see how it continues to grow and evolve. And you know, the McKinley collection is really, really important. Yeah, so I think I'm going to hand it over to Novella. Catherine, do you want to say anything before Novella?
I just want to thank you, Amy. It's wonderful to be able to talk to you. And Kalila and Novella, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Catherine, could you give us the website to your collection?
Yes, it's www.themckinleycollection.com.
themckinleycollection.com. And Amy, is your collection online? Is it part of SUNU Journal? Or do you just kind of tease us a little bit on Instagram?
I tease y'all a little bit on Instagram. I had a private Instagram for it like previously, but I took it down just because I'm, you know, going back to the idea of ethics of care, I'm still figuring out how to best share it. So I just, you know, there's a highlight on my page with it. So you guys can look through that.
Got it. And just some of the questions that you all have really can be answered by getting the African Lookbook. I know someone asked about women photographers that you've come across, and I was actually surprised to even read that. And it's right kind of in the introduction of the book, she talks, Catherine talks a bit about the women photographers during that time. So I definitely think it's worth taking a read because I was surprised by the names. But I was also really happy to see this image from James Bonner because we had the opportunity to host him at the Schomburg Center in 2016. And there was a conversation with him. And I mentioned him only to say that he is still alive and is still with us. And so I think that, you know, the opportunities that we get a chance to be in conversation with these folks who are definitely part of our history. He was documenting Ghana right at the turn of independence or right at the moment of independence. And so a change in Ghana, as well as what was happening in Britain. And so I think he is an important photographer who is still alive and with us. And the last resource I wanted
He's 90, James is 91 years old. He has an exhibition at Serpentine Galleries in London that's coming up. And he's wonderful. Collect his work. It's really Good work.
And he has a book called Ever Young, and the exhibitions, I know that there have been a couple of exhibitions that have traveled with the same title. But the last resource that I want to turn you to is the Schomburg's Photographs and Prints Division, particularly our digital collection, since we are not open at the moment. I had a chance to curate an exhibition that was outdoors as part of Photoville. And I pulled a lot of images from the photograph collection, but some of those images included carta vitae. So you were talking about these calling cards. And I think you have a couple in the book as well. And they were just really interesting images, posed portrait style images that we were also able to use. You can see some of those images at St. Nicholas Park in Harlem if you are in New York. But if you just wanted to take a look at some additional images in the Schomburg's collection, I highly recommend doing that. But again, you can get the African Lookbook at the Schomburg Shop at schomburgshop.com. Thank you so much, Catherine, for allowing the Schomburg to host you on your publication day. And thank you, Amy. Absolutely. And thank you, Amy, so much for agreeing to host this conversation with us. And I would direct everyone to the Schomburg's website at schomburg.org for more of our public programming that is coming up, particularly the work that is coming up for our Black History Month activities. With that said, please, everyone be safe, be kind, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Take care. Do I go?